And I think the most healing thing is to be able to tell your story, to be able to talk about it, to be able to put it out there in the world and have it believed. And, that's one of the first steps, I think, towards healing is being able to tell your story.
Welcome to the TheoTherapist Podcast, where theologically trained licensed therapists share health and healing conversations. Join our host, Dr. Trice for conversations about real-life issues from both theological and therapeutic perspectives.
Hello there, and welcome to the TheoTherapist Podcast. I'm Dr. Trice, your host. We are on season 4. Today is episode 2 of the TheoTherapist Podcast, and we are so glad that you're joining us today. We have another great, awesome guest for us today, and so I am glad that you're here. I do want to encourage you to like, share, and subscribe, as well as follow all of our pages. Definitely make sure your friends know about this particular podcast and share some of our episodes and our clips so that others can kind of get a sense of where we are and what we're sharing. So thank you for your attentiveness today. Today's topic is one that I think is just going to draw in so many people. We have some personal account, but we also have some very real, helpful information for those out there who might be meeting at this intersection that we're discussing today. So the topic for today's podcast is emotional healing after church hurt or spiritual abuse. And we have an awesome guest with us today. We have the Reverend Rebecca Craig, MDiv, who is coming to us. She is a ELCA, in other words, Lutheran pastor. She's an artist. She's a former Disney feature animation story developer, graduate with a journalism degree from University of Nebraska. And she just brings so many different elements of storytelling to us. She's also an author. She has 2 great books, and she's also illustrated a book. Her first book, Once Upon a Nightmare, Through the Looking Glass of Narcissistic Abuse. And we can't wait to hear more about that from her today. But she also has her latest book just released in the past week. And that book is called Through Her Eyes, Biblical Women Speak. We want to talk to her about that today as well. Lastly, she also illustrated a children's book. I mean, what isn't she doing, right? When does she have this time? I don't have it, but she has it. She illustrated a book called Monty, A Tale of No Tale, which I'm curious to hear about how that even started and how that came to be. But we want to thank you, Rebecca, for being with us today. Welcome to the TheoTherapist Podcast. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. I mean, from children's books to narcissist abuse. That's going to be an interesting story arc, I'm sure.
Well, I started out in making animated movies for children. So, the children's book thing seemed a little bit natural. But yeah, then the arc actually gets covered in my first book.
Understandable.
So how I went from point A to point B. Yeah. So
well, and there's so many people who want to be a part of that Disney world in the beginning, right? They want to be a part of the magic and the fantasy of Disney and animation and things. So I'm really curious, even in your story, if you can kind of tell us a little bit about kind of who you are in your early career transition into who you are now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, everybody is when they're growing up, they love Disney and they love the stories. And so it was kind of a fairy tale dream come true for me to go out into Hollywood and land a job doing what I thought was like the perfect merger of my 2 loves, which were both art and writing. I always got told by my parents that journalism was the better route to go because I'd never make any money as an artist, and which was funny because later on I made a lot more money as a graphic designer than I ever did working at Disney as a story developer, but that's beside the point. But yeah, it was, you get into it, and it was that I actually told my mother one time when she came to visit me before I was working at Disney. I drove every day by the Disney studios in Burbank in California, little Nebraska girl living out in California, trying to make her break in Hollywood. And we would drive by the animation building, had the big sorcerer's hat on it. And I would say, one day I'm going to work there. And I just kept saying, one day I'm going to work there. And eventually I did. And it was really through, I always say it is always more about who you know than what you know. And I just happened to temp for the president and the vice president of Disneyland International. And I went into it with an old school work ethic of, instead of bringing a book to read, I was like, what do you need me to do? I'll do it. And they were like, well, here's an expense report. Never done an expense report in my life. Had no idea what I was doing. I spent all day trying to figure it out, but I finally did it, got it done. And the guy just kind of looked at me and he's like, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, why? And he goes, I have never had a temp come in here and actually try to do the job. And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, I would hire you if I had a position open, but I don't. What do you want to do? And he got me an interview over at HR at Disney, feature animation, because I said I wanted to do story development. 6 months later, I was working in story development, but
Right place, right
right.
time,
Yep.
right
Right.
words.
Yep. Just that was how it worked. And eventually kind of what happened was I also learned the hard way that just working hard and doing your job really well is not what gets you promoted. You got
Right.
to play a game.
Unfortunately.
You got to do the backstabbing. You got to do that kind of stuff. And I just finally was like, that's not who I am. And I don't want to play that game and I don't want to be that. But I also don't want to just sit here, you know, this job for the rest of my life doing just, this particular position. I wanted to move on up. And so I ultimately decided to leave rather than engage in some of those tactics to get ahead, and wound up getting into marketing and advertising, which
Okay.
was great, except for the fact that what I wound up doing was working for a bank that wound up being one of the, how should I put this? The top 10 culprits in the 2008 financial crash.
Okay.
And, one of my comments in that was, well, they had me marketing and creating all these materials for these subprime loans, these no documentation, no down payment. And I kept going, I don't know a whole lot about the mortgage industry, but this seems like a bad idea. And they kept telling me, no, it was great for people who were self-employed. And I was like, all right, I don't know. And then I went back home. After that, I had, I guess you might say, and I went before the crash, but I went home in 2001, right before 9/11. And it was basically one of those things where I'm like, what am I even doing out here anymore? Because I came here to do the Hollywood thing and I wasn't doing that anymore. So I was like, why am I here? And
Right.
so I had a moment, a sort of divine intervention, if you will, moment of just awful depression and that kind of stuff. I'd had a boyfriend who dumped me on my birthday. I, wasn't doing anything. And it was just sort of like, what am I doing here? And I had this just overwhelming sense and feeling that I was supposed to leave LA and go back home. And I was like, okay. So I did that and just picked up and left, and they let me take my job with me. And I was doing fine back in Nebraska for about 3 years. But like I said, then 9/11 happened, and that really I had a friend who died in that. And that affected me in some strange ways. And one of them was kind of that whole, what am I doing with my life? Just that. What am I doing? I get up every morning, I walk across the hall to do my job, and it's just so I can make some rich dude richer. And I was like, I don't think that's what I want. And eventually that led me to, I'd always had an interest in religion and theology and things like that. I never saw myself as a pastor ever. That was like, but I was,
Most don't.
yeah, I was really interested in that stuff, and I loved ancient cultures, and I loved history, and I loved all that kind of stuff. And eventually my pastor finally was like, have you thought about seminary? And I was like, why would I do seminary? I was like, that would make me a pastor, and I don't want to be a pastor. I can't be a pastor. There's no way I should be a pastor. I'm the last person who should be a pastor. I should not be telling other people how to live their lives. My life is too big of a mess.
You see the smile on my face. There's a
Yep.
kindred spirit. There's
Yep. Yep.
something
I
that
was like,
resonates.
Yeah, I'm like, there is no way I should be telling other people how they should live their lives or do anything. But it was one of those situations where every excuse I made literally just got, thrown away. And I finally went to visit Luther Seminary up in St. Paul, Minnesota. And during that visit, I just sat there in one of the classes and went, this is where I'm supposed to be. It was just that
Absolutely.
simple, like, no, this is where I belong. This is what I'm supposed to do. So here I am.
As I listen to your story, there's so many resonating points of kind of our similar journeys. And, after the podcast, I'll tell you about how I got into the record industry through that same, I'm going to work here one day kind of mentality, that whole mindset, all the way up until the point of, hey, I guess I'll surrender to this ministry thing, from a visit, going to seminary, sitting in McAfee School of Theology and going, I'm supposed to be here. So it's so interesting how these parallel processes, sometimes just pull us into whatever our next season is and kind of whatever is ahead of us.
Right.
If not, we would feel stuck in kind of where we're supposed to be leaving. And so I'm glad you followed it. I followed it. And I hope other people, if they're fighting and wrestling with it, they'll follow it too. So tell me about your first book and kind of, what brought that toward the forefront for you? What brought that
Yes.
into in the
So,
present being for you?
so my first book was Once Upon a Nightmare, through the looking glass of narcissistic abuse, and that is a memoir that is about primarily my extrication from a marriage from a narcissist and how that played out because he wound up going to federal prison. And I mean, it was one of those things that were, as I was going through it, people would just sit there and go, this is crazy. They're like, this is like a Lifetime movie. And they would sit there and they would say, well, you need to write a book about this or something. And I sat there and I would go, there is no way I am writing a book about that man because he would sue me to oblivion because that's what narcissists do. And then in 2022, I got word that he had passed away. And that kind of opened a door. And I was at lunch with a colleague of mine, and she was reading some of because part of what my healing through that process, that divorce process, was art. And so it was really hard for me to talk or write about everything I had been through, but I would lay everything out. I would tell my story on canvas and I would just paint it out. And she was like, looking at a blog I had done that was an art blog with all my artwork and had little explanations of the paintings and what they meant and that kind of stuff. And she said, you should go on an art tour and give speeches and stuff and talk about this. I think it would help a lot of people. And I sort of was like, that sounds like an awful lot of just out there, kind of, I was like, I don't know that I have what it takes to do that. I said, but I do know I have what it takes to write a book. And she went, perfect, do that. And so every chapter actually in my book is themed around one of my paintings. So like,
Okay.
each chapter is, like this chapter is called Puppet Master and the painting is then this page is, my Puppet Master painting, which you can also kind of see right above me. And inspired, strangely enough, by lots of like fairy tale, fantasy, Alice in Wonderland kind of stuff. And so my book actually brings together a lot of the comparisons and connections between fairy tales, faith, and narcissistic abuse. And what just kind of that rabbit hole of, a wonderland of gaslighting and lies and this just altered reality that you start living in when you're in that kind of a relationship. And so that was kind of the theme I took and ran with for my book. And it just kind of goes through that process. But I also highlight some of not just my own personal journey of this, but, how you can kind of start recognizing what some of these traits are in narcissists and how the church responds and deals. And in my case, I was very lucky that in my first congregation, they were very, very supportive. But it was partly because he went very publicly crazy and it was very clear, what was going on. as opposed to a lot of times also I've been on the other side of it where when you have a narcissist in the church who is abusive, how they can use the church basically as sort of a shield. And also being a pastor and getting divorced is kind of a tricky little realm because there are so many things that go on in your head of I can't get divorced. We're not supposed to get divorced. That's not what God wants. That's not, all of that. And I had to really work through a lot of those issues. And I really wanted this to help other women who are coming out of religious backgrounds that tell them you're supposed to stay in these marriages because you made a vow till death parts you. And it's kind of the light bulb that went off for me finally was that that vow had more to it than just stay in this until you're dead. It was you're supposed to love, honor, and cherish. And none of that was going on. And I'm like, no, this is not that. That vow was violated and that vow is over and done with already. And it was actually over and done with the day I got married. I just didn't know it. And so to help other women, especially, and, in some cases, men, it's not just women, but it's more prevalent, I think, with women being in these relationships and feeling stuck and feeling like they can't get out because religion tells them, no, you got to stick it out. You've got to be the dutiful, submissive wife. And he
And
tried to use that
that's
against me. Definitely.
and that is something that a narcissist would do, right? Use any and every opportunity to kind of keep you submissive and under control. The primary guiding question we have for today's podcast is, what are some ways that we can begin to emotionally heal after, being in a relationship like this, and particularly one that sometimes a church congregation might sanction
Right.
or encourage you to stay in when it's not healthy for you, nor is it going to help your soul thrive.
Right.
I'm wondering for you, you mentioned identifying kind of now you can see and identify some ways that spiritual and emotional abuse are used in relationships like this. Would you speak to some of that for us?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there are the obvious ways it gets used, which is to make women say, you're supposed to do what your husband wants you to do, and you're supposed to stay in this relationship, and blah, blah, blah. That's one of the ways it gets used. But also, legitimately, he did not think I would ever divorce him because I was a pastor. He was like, there is no way she is divorcing me. And he would use, and he would occasionally use Bible verses and things like that to be like, you're supposed to do what I tell you. You're supposed to give me, what I want when I want it and all this kind of stuff. And I would just turn and I would look at him and I would just go, are you really trying to tell me, the pastor, how to understand those passages? So it didn't work with me the way it would have maybe worked with some other people who aren't nearly as well versed in that. But, and there is, when you're in a situation, so beyond even just my marriage, like when you're in a situation with other pastors who are in positions of power, who are abusive, that is such an awful thing. And it happens so frequently. I think we don't have any idea how often it happens. And I can honestly say that I've worked closely with four male pastors. I would say only one of them was not abusive in some fashion. And the others were, and it's sometimes it's subtle, and other times it is just out there in the open. But they're usually so charming and so beloved,
Charismatic.
yeah, and charismatic that no one's going to believe you when you come to them and you tell them that this stuff is going on. And it's really hard in a church setting from that standpoint of dealing with those pastors who behave that way. And there is just a culture within churches where even if people know it's going on, they don't seem to care. And that's the part that has always completely baffled me, where I've had leadership just basically go, well, if we put this out there in the open that this was going on, then that's going to hurt our image in the community, and all the good work we've been doing is going to go to, and I'm like,
But you're hurting the people.
I was like, but who else are you hurting by not addressing the fact that this harm and this misconduct and this, bad stuff is going on? And it's just, it's baffling to me the way that it is not just that person, it's a whole system that continues to protect the abuser and the person at fault. And so that is why it is so hard for people to come forward. And they say, well, why don't they report this? And I'm like, because they don't
Well,
get
it's so
believed.
isolating.
Yeah,
Right. It's isolating. If not only, no one wants to hear your story, no one wants to believe your story. And even if they believe it, they don't have the courage to allow you to kind of bring it to the forefront so it can be addressed. They'd rather you be silenced than allow the story itself to emerge.
right. And the problem with things like gaslighting and stuff like that is you begin to question your own reality. I mean, you begin to question it. And I think I am so thankful I had good therapists. And during my divorce, I had an excellent therapist who really, really walked me through I hesitate to use the term Christian therapist. She would, because but she had a very, very well-versed background in religion and spirituality. And she was able to walk me through things that even as a pastor, I was like, wow. I was like, I can learn from her. And she was phenomenal in walking me through that and helping me to understand this is who God wants you to be versus, what, the church may be trying to sort of frame it as. And then I went through some bad therapists. I had one who told me just to get used to being sexually harassed. And I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Not all therapists are created equal.
No. So you got to be discerning in your therapist. But then I found another one finally who, in one of my last kind of issues that I was dealing with, was I came, I had this. There was an incident that happened, and I was like, I have got to find a therapist because I need to work this out with somebody. And the way that another pastor was responding and dealing with me in response to this incident it was very, I was once again kind of in that wonderland of how is this, what? And I was questioning my own self-worth. I was questioning, am I the one overreacting? What's wrong here? And God bless him. He just finally said, you do realize this is classic abuse and he is being abusive. And I was like, now that you mention it,
Naming it.
now that you've named it, and he started going through all the things that were happening. And I was like, oh my gosh, you are so right. And I think the part that, and his solution was leave, get out of that situation. Good advice. But it did not lead to any kind of change for that particular pastor in that congregation because my leaving left him in place and left that situation ongoing. Oh, I was, and again, the powers that be that knew about it didn't choose to pursue my complaints and, saying, look, this was abusive. It was more just, okay, well, let's see what we can do and how we can move you. And yeah. And in retrospect, I'm like, I don't know that that was the right way to handle that, but how to heal from that though, the number one thing is time, but also again, have a good therapist and tell your
Find a
story.
community.
And I think the most healing thing is to be able to tell your story, to be able to talk about it, to be able to put it out there in the world and have it believed. And, that's one of the first steps I think towards healing is being able to tell your story. And I think that's what I did in both my first book was telling my story. And kind of what I did in my second book as well was I gave voice to a lot of women who in scripture we don't hear from. They get silenced. And so to hear their voice, to hear their story, to hear what they probably were going through. And I think that was one of the things that drove me to write this book was years ago, I did a flash fiction contest that was about taking a biblical character and writing a 500-word story, flash fiction based on that character. Me being the twisted little soul that I am.
Or creative soul. Okay.
I chose the Levite's concubine.
Yeah, that's an interesting story though.
I chose the Levite's concubine.
See,
And
we are sisters. I've done Bible studies on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, if you're not, for people who aren't aware what that story is, that's probably the most horrifying story in the entire Bible.
It is.
It is a story about, a woman who gets thrown out to be raped and abused to death. And then they use her body to cut it up and start a civil war. And so I wrote this 500 word piece of flash fiction on basically her dying moments and what was going through her head and what she was feeling and what she was thinking. And it wound up winning second place instead of first place because the person who won first place wrote Jesus on the cross. And I just was like, that's cheating. I was like, that's cheating.
That should have been the no-brainer. You shouldn't get it just because.
I'm like, come on, people. Like, that's the gimme.
There's no stretch here.
Yeah. But anyway, but I got an email from a guy who wanted to tell me how much he appreciated my story. And he said, I have never, ever viewed that story as anything other than just a theological, plot point. I never saw her as a person. I never saw her
Or
as
humanized
someone.
her.
Yeah, never humanized her. Never saw her as someone who had pain, how she wound up in that position to begin with, what her life might have been like, in this relationship. And it was just this light bulb that went off for me that went, oh my gosh, people don't see these characters as real people and don't see
They don't
those
see
stories.
these women as real people.
Right. And these women who are so important to these, major stories. I mean, you look at the story of the Exodus wouldn't happen without 5 women who defy Pharaoh. It's like they have to go against the decree of Pharaoh in order for Moses to survive. And it's all women, that make this happen. But do they get the accolades in the story? No, it's all about, what Moses is doing and whatever, which is great, but that wouldn't happen without this. The fall of Jericho, Rahab plays a major, this prostitute plays a major role in that actually happening. So this whole kingdom, of Jericho falls, the city of Jericho and the king of Jericho falls because of her. Without her, it probably would not have happened. And, we don't look at those stories from that perspective ever. And so that was kind of what I was trying to do with that second book, was give voice to that and to recognize, the abusive systems that are at play in scripture and how these women have to operate in, being what their lives are. It's like they're in these oppressed patriarchal systems, and yet they find ways to be defiant, to do the things they have to do. And I always find it very interesting that you get women who, you have Shiphrah, you have Puah, you have Tamar, you have the Tamar from Judah, not David's
No,
Tamar.
okay.
And you have Rahab, who all are basically lauded and rewarded for lying. So, it raises that question, are there times
If you
when
say
it's
that,
okay?
if you call it a Jezebel spirit, but in the Bible, they are not only rewarded, but remembered
Right.
for their cunning.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's one of those are the kinds of things I really wanted to bring out and to highlight and ask questions about and to deal with. And so for me, like I said, telling those stories was healing, and being able to shed a light on it is healing. And of course, I do a lot of, as an artist. So if you are artistic in any way, shape, or form, that is always a good healing outlet. Art therapy, man, that is
A great way to
it's one of the
express and pour out.
one of the best ways to express and pour out. But number one, I would say, is being able to tell your story and being able to tell it in a safe way, where when you tell it, you aren't met with all of the people then coming after you, because that's why they stay silent, because especially in churches, because those communities, I mean, if you look at like what happened with, is it John MacArthur's church, where the wife was talking about how abusive this guy was and whatever, they excommunicated her for divorcing him. And then he winds up going to prison, and they do a whole prison ministry around this guy to help him, and never go back and apologize to her. And not that
No
she would
redemption
want,
story for her.
yeah, yeah, Not that anybody, not if I were her, I wouldn't want to go back anyway, but it's that having to find your healing and your wholeness and being able to tell your story in those safe places and to get to that point where those communities you just have to let go of and just say, I can't, I'm not going to be part of that. And I applaud the women who come out of these abusive situations, especially in churches, who still have faith intact. And there are a lot of women who do, and they come out and they are, their faith is intact. They want nothing to do with the institutional church, which is understandable. But they, really cling to, no, I still have faith. I still believe in God. I still believe in Jesus. I still believe in, you know, this God who loves me. But that system I know does not and will not. And that's the hard, thing when the church is supposed to be an active, a force of good in the world, and it can sometimes be a source of great evil. And that part stinks. So yeah.
When our community of faith becomes complicit in our hurting, right? There's a deep wound because this is the place I came to feel safe. This is the place I came to let my guard down, the place I expected, to be upheld, if no place else. And not only am I not receiving that, but in some ways I've been made to feel worse or turned against because I was willing to voice the hurt and the pain that I'm experiencing. And so I think as faith communities have to be very careful and intentional about how we address these. And you find rarely that faith communities won't address it, even in teachings or education or Bible studies or anything of that nature, because they know how interwoven sometimes that is in the life of the church.
How complicit they are in some of the ways that they've helped with the abuse. And I I said in a sermon not too long ago, I found it interesting that, Jesus, in Mary's Magnificat, it's about tearing down the powerful, raising up the marginalized, the poor, the hungry, the downtrodden, the whatever, the marginalized people. And I said, and then when the church decided to form in some kind of more institutional fashion, it did the exact opposite of that. It silenced the marginalized voices. It silenced the oppressed and continued to raise up a patriarchal type of system. And I'm just like, how ironic that that this was the foundation of what they were supposed to be, and they've turned into exactly the thing that was supposed to be undone. Yeah. And so I find that very interesting.
Yeah, the focus transition from compassion to power, as it will when you sometimes gather humans together who are striving for power and recognition. So, but I think this is a great conversation, I believe, for those who either are finding themselves in this questioning period of like, how do I navigate this? How do I come out? Or, I'm experiencing this, I'm on my way out. Hopefully they're finding some encouragement for what this healing journey will look like.
Yeah.
For you, are there any other elements of your story that have kind of helped you heal in addition to your expression through art and your expression through writing and obviously your vocal expression?
So one of the best books I ever read, and I quote him in my memoir, my first book. Desmond Tutu wrote a book called The Book of Forgiving. And that is a book I will recommend to everyone, everywhere, who has ever been dealing with any kind of oppressive, abusive, because obviously, Desmond Tutu's coming out of apartheid South Africa and is part of the Truth and Reconciliation and all of that kind of stuff. And that this man is able to write that book about how to forgive people who do horrible, awful things. And he, has these steps and is very clear that forgiveness is not about the absence of justice, and it's not about the absence of there being any kind of accountability. And in fact, in order for there to be real and true forgiveness, you have to have those things. Otherwise, it's kind of an incomplete sort of forgiveness, and you certainly aren't going to be reconciled in any way, shape, or form. But he leaves so much space and gives permission. And this was the part that I was personally very moved by. was that space and that permission to release a relationship and to say that while yes, reconciliation is the ultimate kind of goal and whatever, recognizing when people refuse to change and they are not someone who is going to be a safe person, they are going to continue to be dangerous to you. You do not need to bring that back into your life. And you can draw those boundaries, and boundaries are good and boundaries are healthy. And you can still do the journey of forgiveness without ever getting back into any kind of a relationship with that individual. And one of the most helpful things also I think that he points out is that when you have been harmed like that, whatever the future relationship looks like, if there is one, is never going to look like it did before. And let that expectation go bye-bye, that you are never, ever going to have the new whatever it is look like the old. And that's okay, because same thing happens with Jesus on the cross, right? Is he comes back and goes back and forgives the people, but he still has the wounds and so he's not hiding what was done. You can't change what was done, but you have to have that forgiveness in order to move forward. And it's also, I think, very important to know that that is not to be used as a weapon against people of saying, well, you need to forgive. You're a Christian, you need to forgive, you need to move on, blah, blah, blah. Forgiveness is a process.
It is.
And there is no timetable to it. There is no, just forgive and forget, is no just a quick fix of, I forgive you, let's just move on. And not when there is that kind of deep level of hurt and abuse. And you cannot move forward without acknowledging that, without addressing that, without there being some kind of accountability for that. And the relationship will change. It will be different.
And
And
it
that's
should.
okay. Yeah. And it should, and that's okay. And that relationship is never going to look the same. And that's okay too. And I think that's one of the most important things, is to recognize that you're not going backwards. You're never going to recapture that. Yeah.
Whatever that fairy tale was is gone, right? That fairy tale that you initially had, that it's all going to be rosy, it's going to be what I expect it to be. Now you have a reality that contradicts that it won't look that way, right? The other thing I say about forgiveness is it is a process and you can't rush it. You can't just decide, I'm going to do it because somebody told me to do it. It is a personal decision at some point, but it is for you. It is not for the other person. Someone can't say, I want to make you forgive me. No, I have to decide if I choose forgiveness. And when I choose forgiveness, that doesn't entitle you to access. Just because I can choose not to wish any harm to you, I can choose to let this thing go, doesn't mean you have access in my life beyond this. Sometimes I have to remove access because you are not good for me.
Yeah. And the weaponization of it is one that just really gets to me. I had someone one time who I was trying to get some accountability from, a system from whatever. So I was kind of continuing to, be like, no, this person's not safe. This is not whatever. And I had someone who came to me and basically, in a very subtle kind of way during a meeting one time just went, well, if you don't have the love of Jesus in your heart to forgive, do you really have the love of Jesus? And I just was like, really? That's where you want to go with this? Or, someone who was trying to say, well, if you hold our worst moments against us. And I was just like,
So no accountability for your actions, no
right.
sense of remorse on your part.
Right. And that was, kind of where that's when it gets weaponized, where it is forgiveness gets used as a bludgeon to silence you and to make you stop, saying this needs to get fixed, or this needs to be addressed, or this person is not safe. The forgiveness thing gets thrown at you to try and silence you, to keep you from continuing to pound that drum and say, no, this needs to be addressed. And if we do
Absolutely.
not address it, then bad things are going to happen. And yeah,
And we become complicit in the bad things because we participated in the system that would not allow that to be addressed so that it could be changed, so that someone else would be protected.
yep, yeah.
This
So
has been a awesome conversation. It's a wonderful conversation, I think, and needed for so many people. It's just scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah.
I would like for you to tell, our listeners, because obviously you're a great storyteller, how they can get your audiobook or how they can get your book so that they can stay in contact with what you're doing. Just tell them how they can find you and what to pick up from you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I have my website, which you can always, find anything you need there, which is RebeccaJCraig.com. Has my books, has my art, has all of that. You can, if you want to go, buy my book, you can, of course, for the first one, my publisher, unfortunately, only goes through Amazon. So the only way to get this one right now is either to contact me personally to send you a copy, which I'm happy to do, or you have to buy it through Amazon. The audiobook is also available on Amazon through Audible. And then my other book is Through Her Eyes, Biblical Women Speak. You can find this one pretty much anywhere online books are sold, for one thing. So if you go to Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Bookshop, pretty much any of those places. I even found one on eBay the other day, and I was like, how does eBay have it after it's only been released for a week? But because I had somebody in Australia that was trying to buy my book, so I looked to see where you could get it if you lived in Australia. And so you can get it pretty much. And my audiobook for the moment is only available on Audible. I am hoping after about the 90-day kind of exclusive window that you do with Audible, I hope then to have it available in places like Libby. And so you can get it out of the library. And of course, because this is through Ingram, you request your library carry it, that they can purchase a few copies and they can get it for you.
And once again, I got a chance to hear an excerpt through the Audible which is just the introduction, Through Her Eyes, and I was hooked. Just by the introduction, I was like, okay, I absolutely have to get this. For someone who, of course, studies female figures in the Bible, and I'm the one who definitely is not always doing a Proverbs 31 on a sermon. I'm a Deborah and Prisca kind of person. And so for those who really study women in the Bible or who are intrigued by different stories of women in the Bible, other than the traditional ones you tend to hear from a patriarchal standpoint, I definitely encourage you to get this book. I'd love to sit down and have a dialogue, a book club with some people and really just sit around and talk about it. But it's a great opportunity and it's a great read.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here today. We are so happy that you joined us amidst everything else that you're doing to promote your books and all the great things that you're doing. We wish you well, we wish you peace, and we wish you thriving.
Thank you. Same to you.
Awesome. Once again, thank you so much for joining the TheoTherapist Podcast. We will be back with another episode soon, and we hope that you'll tune in. Make sure that you like, subscribe, and share our podcast information. Also, visit us on our website, TheoTherapist.com. There you can see past episodes. You can also read our blogs and check out some gallery information that we have for you. Take care of yourself and be well. Church and ministry leaders, join us for mental health response training with Dr. Trice Glenn. This training was designed to equip leaders with best practices and strategies to help when responding to those in the community and members who may be facing mental health challenges. Training sessions are interactive, they have open discussion groups, and provide useful resources that will help you go beyond the training. To register, visit seeksolacenow.com/church training.
TheoTherapist Podcast, real talk at the intersection of theology and therapy. Check out Dr. Glenn's new journal series titled Brain Dump Journals for the Busy, available on Amazon. Visit our websites for more information at thetheotherapist.com or catriceglenn.com.